Right now, I'd like to invite Marghee to come up, and she's going to give us a little bit of update on the medical observations that she sees in our community. So please help me give a warm welcome to Marghee Maupin.
Hi, my name is Marghee Maupin. I'm a primary care provider on the west side in Waimea. And I wasn't sure if I was speaking tonight, so I'm kind of fishing for a little bit what to say, mostly because there's so much information. I'm not sure how to narrow it down exactly. Oh, thank you. But I do want to talk about a letter that I got from PANA, a scientist, this morning. So I'm going to read a little bit of that. And this is in regards to the what they called the stinkweed results on the west side that were making up to 60 children ill. And what didn't seem to be publicized well was that besides the stinkweed component of that study, there were 4 restricted use pesticides that were found outside and inside Waimea Middle School. And so I called her and asked her to give me some input on that. And the concern that I have is that, yes, the results show that the levels are below the levels of concern. However, a lot of these kids, to my knowledge, have been in that area since conception. So when you look at that exposure over time, what are the effects of that? That didn't come out in the study. That hasn't really come out at all as far as the chronic effects. So what are the impacts of chronic exposures to pesticides? Well, epidemiological studies report evidence of adverse effects of pesticide exposure on agricultural workers and pesticide applicators. Some of the most concerning evidence comes from exposure of children. Children are an especially vulnerable population due to the fact that they are still developing. If exposure occurs during critical periods of development, the consequences of that exposure are potentially for the long term. For instance, clinical data suggests that acute pesticide poisonings occurring in childhood may lead to lasting neurological behavior deficits. However, the potential for impacts of chronic exposures to pesticides also raises warning flags. Pound for pound, children breathe more air and drink more water than adults and are therefore more susceptible to exposures to environmental contaminants. Routes of exposure include air, food, water, and dust. Children explore their world through hand-to-mouth behaviors or pesticide residues that enter the home and are present in dust break down far more slowly due to lessened exposures to the elements, i.e. air and sunlight, that normally hasten the breakdown of these residues. And low doses do matter. A prime example of chemicals that act at low doses are endocrine disrupting compounds, which act to disrupt the delicate balance of hormones that control processes that are essential to life, such as reproduction and metabolism. A 2012 review by 12 prominent endocrinologists examined effects frequently associated with these chemicals and concluded that whether low doses of EDCs influence certain human disorders is no longer conjecture. For example, ample evidence collected by multiple investigators demonstrate that the pesticide atrazine is a known EDC that acts at low doses. In the case of chlorpyrifos, and that was one of the pesticides that was found inside Waimea Middle School and outside Waimea Middle School, when the study was done in 2013, and it was done about 4 separate times, and it was found every single time. A pesticide used on Kauai prenatal exposure at low levels have been linked to adverse impacts on neurodevelopment in children in several peer-reviewed studies. Low levels of exposure do not necessarily mean that the children on Kauai are safe from impacts of a drift-prone pesticide like chlorpyrifos. So I've done some studying about chlorpyrifos on my own because it was not in our training, because it's not ethical to expose people over a long period of time. So we're not trained to learn those types of things. But what chlorpyrifos can do or is responsible for is neurological changes, but not only neurological changes, other things too. But the one thing that I think is especially interesting is that it lowers IQ. So not only are we exposing these children to pesticides that will cause chronic illness and probably pass that on to next generations, we're also dumbing them down so that therefore they can't really respond as maybe we can respond to such a situation as we are now. The University of Hawaii 2013 air sampling study, air sampling and analysis for pesticide residues and odorous chemicals in and around Waimea, Kauai, examined ambient air at Waimea Middle School and other Kauai schools. 5 pesticides were detected at Waimea Middle School in passive air samples in both indoor and outdoor sites, as I was saying, as well as high volume air samples. The pesticides detected by the air samples were chlorpyrifos, metolachlor, it's hard to say a lot of these, and then for 3 other ones. But all we heard and was publicized was that it was stinkweed. And then what came out in the Garden Island today, more disturbing news. A new study by the State Department of Health detected trace amounts of pesticide in streams and waterways across the state, including 8 locations on Kauai. Every waterway that was tested on Kauai had restricted use pesticides in it. And of course, they're all leading to the ocean. The good news for Kauai, according to the Department of Health, environmental toxicologist and supervisor Phoenix Grange, is that the substances found did not exceed state and federal regulatory limits. I'm so tired of hearing this, that it's below the levels of concern, or the regulatory limits, or like I said, when you look at a child who's been exposed since conception, are we looking at that, or are we looking at a one-time spray into the face? That doesn't discern in any of the materials that I have looked at. None of these levels present a risk to human health or the environment. Really? I have a hard time believing that. However, a number of chemicals were detected around the island, with 2 exceeding aquatic life benchmarks established by an environmental protection agency. In other words, they said that the waterways were below levels of concern, but the levels of concern were below levels, except for some waterways, or some of the waterways that were leading into the ocean, and those were not below the levels of concern. Those were above. So to me, that means way above, because they're so conservative about this. Let's see. 2 locations on the west side, the drainage canal at Kikiaola Boat Harbor and an unnamed ditch on Kekaha Road, saw 11 detections each. According to the findings, Kikiaola exceeded aquatic life benchmarks for both atrazine and metolachlor. So both of those chemicals were found in waterways above the limit